The year is 859 AD. A Muslim scholar sitting in Cordoba receives a message that simply does not make sense. Vikings, the savage northern raiders who have spent decades terrorizing the Atlantic coastlines, have just struck a city in North Africa. He reads it a second time. The geography alone makes it feel impossible. For a Viking fleet to reach North Africa from Scandinavia, they would have to sail down the entire Atlantic coast of Europe, push through the Strait of Gibraltar, a passage firmly held by Islamic naval forces, and then drive deep into the Mediterranean Sea. No northern force has ever attempted this. The report has to be wrong. But 3 days later, another message arrives. Then, another. Then reports begin flooding in from Sicily, from southern France, from islands that haven't seen a northern raider in living memory. The Vikings aren't just in the Mediterranean. They are everywhere, and the question that begins haunting the courts of Cordoba isn't how did they get here? It's something far more unsettling. What else have we been completely wrong about? Before we get into it, if you're new here, make sure you hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It genuinely helps this channel more than you'd think. This is the story of a raid that didn't simply terrorize cities. It demolished the assumptions that made an entire empire feel untouchable, and what followed would reshape Mediterranean warfare for generations to come. To truly understand what made 859 so catastrophic, you have to go back 15 years, back to 844 AD, back to Seville. The first warning came from a small fishing village near the mouth of the Guadalquivir River. Strange ships had been spotted, dozens of them, moving upriver with clear and deliberate purpose. By the time that warning reached Seville, the Vikings were already within striking distance. The garrison scrambled to prepare. Civilians were pushed behind the walls. Scouts came back with fleet estimates. At least 80 ships, possibly more. Thousands of warriors. But the Vikings didn't besiege Seville the way anyone expected. They attacked immediately and without hesitation. What followed was 7 days of brutal fighting that exposed just how completely unprepared Andalusian forces were for this kind of warfare. The Vikings didn't operate like conventional armies. There were no camps, no supply lines, no predictable assault patterns. They struck from the river, pulled back to their ships, and hit again from an entirely different position. The garrison had no way of knowing where the next blow would land. On the 4th day, sections of the outer defenses were broken through. Vikings poured into the residential districts. Fires tore through wooden structures. The administrative quarter was ransacked. By the 7th day, organized resistance had completely collapsed. The Vikings didn't stay to occupy Seville. They never intended to. They took silver from the treasury, trade goods from the warehouses, and captives from the streets. Then they walked back to their ships, sailed down the Guadalquivir, and left behind a city that would spend years trying to recover. Arabic sources suggest hundreds of people, possibly over 1,000, were loaded onto those ships and carried north to slave markets. The political fallout reached Cordoba before the fires had even gone cold. The Emir, Abd al-Rahman II, faced a crisis that went beyond a simple military defeat. Seville wasn't some frontier outpost. It was a major economic center, a symbol of Andalusian prosperity and strength. Its fall to northern barbarians put the Emirate's entire reputation for protecting its own people into question. The response had to be decisive, and it was. What came next was one of the most comprehensive military overhauls in Andalusian history. Abd al-Rahman II didn't just rebuild Seville, he redesigned the entire defensive architecture of the Atlantic coast from the ground up. The first priority was naval power. Before 844, the Emirate had almost no meaningful naval capacity. The ocean had been treated as a barrier, not a battlefield. That thinking was now dead. New shipyards were established along the Guadalquivir. Master shipwrights were recruited from across the Islamic world. Within 3 years, a permanent fleet of purpose-built warships was stationed near Seville. These weren't converted merchant vessels, they were designed specifically for river combat and coastal interception. Lighter than Mediterranean galleys, maneuverable in strong currents, equipped for boarding and ranged combat. The crews were trained in tactics drawn from Byzantine naval doctrine, but adapted for the unique demands of riverine warfare. The mission was simple. If Viking ships ever entered the Guadalquivir again, they would face organized naval resistance long before they reached Seville. The second priority was intelligence. A network of coastal watchtowers was constructed stretching from Galicia all the way to the Strait of Gibraltar. Each tower was permanently staffed with trained observers, signal equipment, and enough provisions for extended watches. The system ran on visual communication. When a tower spotted Viking ships, signal fires were lit. The next tower would see the smoke and light its own. Information that had previously taken days to travel now reached Cordoba in hours. The third priority was fortification. Seville's walls were expanded and reinforced. River barriers were added, physical obstructions that could be deployed across the Guadalquivir to block ship passage entirely. Garrisons were enlarged and retrained in anti-raiding tactics. The same improvements were rolled out to Lisbon, Cadiz, and Silves. By 850 AD, the entire Atlantic coastline of Al-Andalus had been militarized from end to end. The system was tested repeatedly over the following decade, and it held every single time. In 846, Viking ships probed the Galician coast. The watchtowers caught them immediately. Local forces mobilized before the raiders could establish any position. The Vikings withdrew with minimal success. In 852, another fleet attempted to push up the Tagus River toward Lisbon. Naval forces intercepted them at the river mouth. A battle occurred, and the Vikings fell back. In 1858, a small fleet appeared near the Guadalquivir entrance, saw the garrison mobilized and ready, and turned north without even attempting an assault. Each incident confirmed what Cordoba believed it already knew. The defenses worked. The Vikings had been studied, measured, anticipated, and contained. By the summer of 859, 15 years after the trauma of Seville, confidence had fully returned to the courts of Cordoba. The northern barbarians were understood. Their tactics were familiar. Their approach routes were monitored. Their capabilities had been calculated and neutralized. The Viking problem had been solved. That certainty would survive for approximately 6 weeks. When the watchtower network detected a large Viking fleet off the Galician coast in the summer of 859, the initial reports estimated 60 to 80 ships. One of the largest northern fleets seen in years, but the size alone wasn't alarming. Large fleets had come before and been turned away. What mattered was pattern recognition, and the pattern was immediately familiar. The fleet moved south along the Atlantic coast, raiding small Galician settlements, avoiding fortified positions, targeting vulnerable coastal villages, and keeping mobile. This was textbook Viking behavior. Intelligence reports flowed steadily into Cordoba. Military lists tracked the fleet's progress. Predictions were made, positions were anticipated, and when the Vikings reached Lisbon, the response was already waiting. The city's garrison was on full alert. Naval forces were positioned offshore. Reinforcements had been dispatched from neighboring settlements. The Vikings attacked. The assault lasted 2 days. They probed multiple entry points. The defenses held. Naval forces harassed their ships as they withdrew. After taking casualties without breaking through, the Vikings pulled back. From Cordoba's perspective, this was a textbook success. The system designed in the years after 844 had functioned exactly as intended. The fleet continued south. When they approached the Guadalquivir, the site of Seville's fall 15 years earlier, the Andalusian response was immediate and overwhelming. Every warship stationed at Seville was mobilized. The naval garrison took blocking positions at the river mouth. Reinforcements rode hard from Cordoba. This was the moment every year of preparation had been building toward. The Vikings arrived, conducted reconnaissance, sent small boats to probe the river defenses, and skirmished with Andalusian patrol craft. For 3 days, the two forces watched each other. Then the Vikings withdrew. No major engagement, no sustained assault, no attempt to force passage. They turned away and sailed south along the coast. In Cordoba, this was interpreted as the ultimate vindication. The Vikings had tried the same approach that worked in 844, found it defended by a professional naval force positioned specifically to stop them, assessed the cost as too high, and given up. Messages went out to regional commanders. Viking fleet repelled at the Guadalquivir. Defenses confirmed effective. Threat assessment downgraded. The fleet continued moving south, past the last coastal watchtower, toward the southwestern tip of Iberia. And then something happened that no intelligence report, no military analyst, and no strategic planner had ever considered a real possibility. The Vikings didn't turn north back toward the Atlantic. They didn't sail west into open ocean. They turned east, toward the Strait of Gibraltar. The strait was 14 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. On a clear day, you could stand on the European shore and see Africa with your bare eyes. Ships crossed it constantly. Merchants, fishermen, patrol craft. The physical passage itself took hours. But psychologically and strategically it represented something immense. It was the line between the known and the unknown, between the civilized Mediterranean and the chaotic Atlantic, between Islamic-controlled waters and everything beyond. More specifically, it was the line that Vikings did not cross. This wasn't speculation, it was confirmed by decades of direct observation. Vikings raided the Atlantic coasts of Francia, Brittany, England, Ireland, and Iberia. They pushed as far south as Morocco's Atlantic shore. They operated across northern waters from the Baltic to the Irish Sea. But they did not enter the Mediterranean. The strategic logic was airtight. Viking longships were built for coastal raiding. Shallow drafts for navigating rivers, speed for striking and vanishing before defenders could respond. Their entire tactical advantage depended on mobility and surprise. The Mediterranean offered neither. It was an enclosed sea dominated by established naval powers, the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic Caliphate, the Italian city-states. All of them maintained permanent professional fleets designed for prolonged Mediterranean engagements, supported by dense networks of ports and supply chains. A Viking fleet entering the Mediterranean would be sailing away from everything that made them dangerous, away from their supply lines, away from familiar waters, into a closed sea where every coastline was claimed and every port was monitored by enemies who had been fighting each other for centuries. Why take that risk when the Atlantic offered unlimited soft targets and easy escape routes? The logic was so complete, so persuasive, that it had quietly shaped defensive planning across the entire Islamic Mediterranean. The watchtower networks, the naval patrol routes, the garrison deployments, all of it was built around threats that came from within the Mediterranean world. The Strait of Gibraltar was monitored, but the monitoring was aimed at controlling trade and stopping rival fleets from slipping into the Atlantic. The idea that northern raiders might try to enter from the other direction wasn't even treated as a low-probability threat. It had been dismissed entirely, not because sailing through was physically impossible, but because every strategic calculation said it made no sense. The Vikings had never done it. They had no reason to do it now. When the Viking fleet sailed toward the strait in the summer of 859, the patrol forces stationed there were not positioned to intercept a northern fleet coming from the Atlantic side. Because northern fleets didn't do that, when 60 to 80 Viking longships appeared and sailed straight through, the response was confusion. By the time messages reached commanders who could authorize a pursuit, the Vikings were already on the other side. And the moment they crossed that threshold, every single defensive calculation in Al-Andalus became worthless overnight. The watchtower network faced west toward the Atlantic, not south toward the Mediterranean shores of Iberia. The naval forces were stationed at Atlantic river mouths, the Guadalquivir, the Tagus, the Douro, not patrolling a Mediterranean coastline that had never needed them. The garrison deployments were concentrated in cities that faced the Atlantic or sat vulnerable along river approaches, not scattered across the southern Iberian shore. The entire defensive system had been engineered around the assumption that Viking threats came from a specific direction. The Vikings had just made that assumption irrelevant. The first target was Algeciras, a port city on the Mediterranean side of the Strait. The city had defenses, but they were built for conventional enemies and familiar threats. When Viking longships materialized offshore, the garrison responded, but they were reacting to something they had never trained to face. The Vikings struck the port district hard, seized supplies, and pulled back before organized resistance could form. Then they crossed to North Africa. The distance from Algeciras to the Moroccan coast was under 30 kilometers, an afternoon's sailing for a Viking fleet. They made landfall near Nakor. Nakor was not a minor settlement. It was a regional capital, a center of trade, and the seat of a local dynasty with real military power. The city had walls, a trained garrison, and a ruler who commanded serious respect across the western Maghreb. What Nakor did not have was any mental framework for the possibility of a Viking attack. The concept would have registered as absurd. Vikings existed in the distant frozen north. Nakor was in North Africa. The two worlds were separated by thousands of kilometers of ocean, an entire peninsula, and the fundamental shape of the known world. Yet on a summer day in 859, Viking longships arrived at Nakor's shore. The ruler of Nakor mobilized immediately. The city's defenses were activated. The garrison took their positions. Civilians were moved behind the inner walls. Messengers galloped out requesting reinforcements from allied territories. What followed demonstrated exactly how effective Viking tactics were against opponents who had no experience with them. The Vikings didn't lay conventional sieges. They applied pressure at multiple points simultaneously, drawing defenders to one section of wall while concentrating force elsewhere. They used psychological pressure, sustaining assaults through heavy casualties to project an image of unlimited manpower and absolute commitment. Most devastatingly, they exploited the garrison's fundamental ignorance. How many warriors did the Vikings have? What were their true siege capabilities? How long could they keep this up? Would they accept a negotiated surrender, or were they committed to total conquest? The defenders had no idea, and that uncertainty corrupted every decision they tried to make. The siege lasted over a week, though sources differ on the exact duration. Whether the Vikings physically breached the fortifications, or whether the city's leadership calculated that surrender was preferable to continued bloodshed, remains unclear. What every source agrees on is the outcome. Nakor fell. The ruler was captured. A significant North African city had been taken by northern raiders who, by every established principle of strategic geography, should never have been able to reach it. The Vikings occupied Nakor for 8 days, possibly longer. They systematically stripped the city, treasury contents, trade goods, valuables from wealthy households. Everything portable and worth taking was loaded onto the longships. That the most valuable cargo was human. Arabic sources suggest hundreds of inhabitants were seized. Some accounts claim over 1,000. Men, women, and children were marched to the ships. The Viking economy ran in part on an established slave trade. Captives were transported to markets in Scandinavia, Ireland, and Francia. Those from wealthy families could be ransomed. The rest were sold as labor. Nakor was processed according to Hat economic logic. The city itself was not destroyed, because a destroyed city had no future value as a target. After 8 days, the Vikings withdrew. loaded their ships, and sailed back toward the Iberian coast. The people of Naka who remained would recover. The ruler was eventually ransomed and reappears in later historical records. But the psychological shockwave extended far beyond one North African city, because if Vikings could reach Nakara, there was no coastline in the Mediterranean they couldn't reach. The raid on Nakara was not the end of the campaign, it was the opening act. For the next 3 years, from 859 to 862, the same fleet operated across the entire Western Mediterranean. They established no permanent bases, attempted no territorial conquest, and never stopped moving. They didn't need to. The advantage of being somewhere completely unexpected was inexhaustible as long as they kept moving. The Balearic Islands were hit multiple times. Majorca and Minorca, both under Islamic authority, had never prepared for northern raiders. Their defenses were calibrated for Mediterranean threats, rival fleets, pirate groups, military expeditions from hostile states. When the Vikings arrived, the island settlements had no answer for them. The coast of southern France was raided. The Camargue, the delta region around the Rhone, was attacked, settlements burned, trade routes disrupted. Frankish authorities, already stretched thin dealing with internal conflicts and other Viking groups pressing from the north, found themselves attacked from the Mediterranean side, a direction no one had planned for. They struck Islamic coastal positions in Iberia again, demonstrating to every city that had invested heavily in Atlantic defenses that their Mediterranean shores were completely exposed. Some sources suggest the fleet pushed as far east as the Italian coast. These account ends are disputed, and some historians believe later sources may have confused different Viking groups. But the fact that it was considered plausible at all reflects how thoroughly the psychological boundary of the Mediterranean had been shattered. What is beyond dispute is duration. This was not a single summer's raiding followed by a return home. The fleet stayed for multiple years. That sustained, unpredictable presence created a constant background pressure on every coastal authority in the Western Mediterranean. No one could say where they would appear next. No one could say when they would finally leave. The standard defensive model, fortify the important positions, run naval patrols, respond after attacks occur, was simply not designed for an enemy that could strike any vulnerable point across hundreds of kilometers of coastline and then disappear. By 861, regional authorities were beginning to coordinate. Islamic and Christian forces in Iberia were sharing intelligence on Viking movements. Naval patrols were expanded. Coastal settlements were told to maintain elevated alert levels. But the Vikings were not defeated by any military force or combined response. They left somewhere between 861 and 862. The precise timing is uncertain. The fleet departed the Mediterranean. Whether they sailed back through the Strait of Gibraltar or took a different route home is unknown. What remained behind was a single haunting question. Would they come back? The Viking campaign of 859 to 862 conquered no territory, held no cities, and left no permanent presence. By the conventional measures of military success, it achieved nothing lasting, and yet it produced something more durable than any conquest. It demonstrated that the Mediterranean's most sophisticated defensive systems could be made irrelevant not by overpowering them, but simply by approaching from the direction they had never been designed to face. Every wall, every warship, every watchtower, every carefully rehearsed response protocol had been built on a set of assumptions about where threats came from and how they would behave. The Vikings had walked through the one gap those assumptions left open and spent 3 years proving that being unexpected was a more powerful weapon than being unbeatable. That lesson would echo through Mediterranean military thinking for generations, not because the Vikings kept coming back, but because every coastal commander who lived through those years understood something they could never fully unlearn. The threat you have prepared for is not the threat that destroys you. It's the one you decided wasn't worth preparing for. If you made it to the end, you're exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next, and drop a like if this was worth your time. It means more than you know.